Hi, Rebecca.
Hi, Bob.
How are you?
I'm very well. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine. I'm excited because you're a rare guest. We don't usually do novelists, but you've written a novel about ideas and about people who deal with ideas, and that qualifies it as a legitimate fare for Blogging Heads discussion. I should tell people you are Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, who's written a number of books. Not all of them novels, but this one is called 36 Arguments for the Existence of God.
And the subtitle, which is very important.
The subtitle is, what is the subtitle?
The subtitle is A Work of Fiction.
A Work of Fiction. Well, I saw that, and I thought, surely that's not the subtitle.
It is, because it's a bit of a joke, to say 36 Arguments for the Existence of God.
Well, it's a clever, I think you're going to double the number of people who pick up the book, I think. And in fact, the book itself almost plays it both ways, because first of all, the very unusual structure. First of all, the chapters of the novel itself are all titled after arguments for the existence of God, not kind of classically, famous arguments, but things like the argument from the eternity of irony, the argument from Lucinda. That's certainly not a classic one. But then you also have an appendix where you actually go over classic arguments for the existence of God, like William James's pragmatic argument, and actually do serious commentary on them. And of course, this gets at the fact that you have two identities. You came up as an academic, right? And yet you've become a novelist as well. And in fact, I think I remember your first novel, The Mind-Body Problem, was written. When was that written? Were you still studying philosophy? Or
no,
what?
I was a very young assistant professor at Barnard College at Columbia.
Okay.
And did the kind of suicidal thing of writing a novel. So that certainly surprised my philosophical colleagues. So it was, I guess it was quite controversial for them.
Just the fact that, why? Did they consider it some kind of tell-all or something?
No.
Like you were letting people peek behind the curtain?
Well, there might have been a bit of that. But I guess there were two academic communities that were involved in the story of the mind-body problem. One were philosophers and one were mathematicians. And the mathematicians tended to be very, very happy that a novelist had paid attention to them. The philosophers, less so. But also, I was trained in analytic philosophy, and in particular in philosophy of science, mathematical logic. So I didn't do what are considered the softer parts of philosophy areas. I didn't do continental philosophy or existentialism or phenomenology. I was one of, especially at that time, but still, I'm sorry to say, one of the very few women who was doing what's considered, hardcore stuff. And then I go and do a frivolous thing like write a novel. It was considered kind of frivolous. And so I think there was that to contend with. And
so you sound a little like a character in your latest book, Lucinda Mandelbaum, the goddess of game theory, who is a game theorist, and game theory has largely been a man's game, I guess. Yeah. But do you feel any identity with her?
Well, I do. I feel identity with all of my characters in every novel. And so, yes, I do feel some identity with her. I hope she's somewhat embittered. I hope I'm not embittered, but it is hard to be a woman, one of the few women in a field dominated by men. You never forget it. You never. You're always aware of how hard you have to be trying to be taken seriously. And so, as I say, it was a crazy thing for me to, while I was pursuing that field and publishing in that field, to go and publish a novel. But I felt it very, very strongly. I felt that I needed to write that novel, and usually when I write a novel, it's against my better judgment and almost against my will, because well, for various reasons, but I'm always pushed into it because I feel there's something I can say, something I can explore that can only be said or explored in fiction. And even sometimes when there are philosophical issues, I feel that I need to do it in fiction because I need to embed it in life and show how these ideas play out in life and explore it from many points of view. And of course, fiction allows me to do that. So I, it's always I have to overcome my resistance. But I really do. I love fiction. I love to read it. I love to write it. I think it is. I actually think it is philosophically important, and I think it's ethically important fiction.
Yeah, I'm actually not generally much of a reader of fiction. I would read more if I had more time. But I've got to say, I started reading this the other night and found that I continued reading, I think partly because it is about ideas and about people kind of in the ideas business, academics, and because some of them bear a certain resemblance to real-life people, and I want to eventually maybe ask you about that. I mean, this guy, what is it, Cass Seltzer, who is he's become a kind of a, he's a new atheist, but a new atheist with a soul, and superficially at least, he made me think of a couple of people, certainly Daniel Dennett and a little bit maybe of Richard Dawkins, less so.
I have to tell you.
I won't get into the question of whether either of them manifestly has a soul. That's a separate question. But I do want to get into, and there's some other characters that seem to me comparable to actual existing people, and we can talk about that later. But before we do, why don't you? I mean, you just said that you write novels because there are things you can get at that are hard to get at otherwise, or express that are hard to express otherwise. What were you trying to get at with this book?
Okay, so usually, and it's probably that way for you as well, I think for most writers, books grow out of other books, so something's left over from one's last book that you need to explore, and that was the case with me. So the last book I had done was nonfiction, and it was called Betraying Spinoza, the Renegade Jew Who Gave Us Modernity, and it was, it was about Spinoza, who's a great philosophical love of mine, but it was a very enjoyable book to write. And then I was very surprised after the book was published to be introduced into a community I had known nothing about before, which is organized non-religion. And Spinoza is a great hero to this community, as he ought to be. He deserves to be. And I started getting all of these invitations to various secular humanist organizations I hadn't known exists, or to be on the board of Sam Harris's Reason Foundation, and all of these, to lecture at a congregation of Jewish atheists in Cambridge, Massachusetts, who meet every Saturday. And this was all very surprising to me. I should say that I grew up in a very religious community, in an Orthodox Jewish community. And, so I know community, I know faith communities very intimately. And I was surprised that non-religion had been organized in this way. And that set me thinking about why that might be the case. But it also introduced me to people who really identified themselves as atheists. And I am an atheist. I probably became one, sometime in adolescence, but it didn't keep me from spending most of my life within Orthodox Judaism. And I was just sort of surprised by people who so define themselves by atheism. And often though I completely agreed philosophically with the people I was meeting, I felt that they weren't understanding everything about what it's like to feel God's presence, or even more importantly, in my case, to be part of a community, of a faith community, part of a family that takes religion very seriously. And there was something I felt that they weren't getting. And also, as I got more and more involved in these questions of, the religious versus atheist, I was more and more shocked by what I was hearing often from religious people about how atheists must lack all moral sense and there is no grounding for the difference between right and wrong if you don't have God, which is, philosophically a very erroneous point of view. But what I felt was, oh, look at this. Even the people I agree with are diminishing or reducing the people I don't agree with, and I felt like I had to defend them. Well, both sides, I guess. I felt that both sides there was a lot of understanding that was lacking. Whenever that happens to me, I start thinking. Well, first I start, thinking I have to write a book about it, or I have to write an essay, and I did write a few essays about it. But for me, and I'm lucky that I have this to turn to, that I can write fiction. The best way to explore this is in fiction. So that's how this novel grew up out of the last book.
Okay. Hi again, Rebecca. I had a technical problem that did not detract from the answer you were giving when I had the problem, so that is all intact, although I may, during the latter part of your answer, have a seemingly frozen expression on my face. But your answer gives rise to a number of possible questions. Let me throw two things at you that crossed my mind as you spoke, and you can pick up wherever you want. One is you mentioned Spinoza early on, who is fascinating. You were talking about some kind of non-religious people who had latched on to him. I think in Spinoza, and you're a Spinoza expert, so you would know, and I wouldn't. I think in Spinoza's day, he would have probably insisted he was religious. On the other hand, he's considered a pantheist, and pantheists, as I understand it, think that the way to think of God is as identical to the universe. And I've always wondered whether that did, in fact, qualify as religious. But because it seems to me like just kind of giving another name to the universe, right? Mm-hmm. And actually, why don't I stop there and see if you, as a Spinoza scholar, among other things, want to straighten me out on that, and then I can get on to the other thing that crossed my mind.
Sure. So, of course, so many things that you've raised, and I'll try as briefly as I can to do a little bit of justice to it. Spinoza in his day was certainly thought of as a heretic. He was excommunicated from his own community, the Jewish Portuguese community that was residing in Amsterdam.
And this is during what period?
17th century.
Okay.
He was a younger contemporary of Descartes. He overlapped just a bit with Descartes and also with Leibniz. So he's one of the great 17th century rationalists. And once he was expelled from his own community, he was castigated, vilified by greater Christian Europe. It was well into the Age of Enlightenment. In Conste, it was a way of smearing somebody by saying that they were a Spinozist, therefore an atheist, therefore a fatalist, therefore a immoralist. So he was very much seen as an atheist well into the Age of Enlightenment. And that in itself is a huge story. Was he or wasn't he? He himself always claimed to be religious, to take offense at being called an atheist. His conception of God, as you point out, identifying it with nature, is so different from the Abrahamic conceptions of God, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, that you can claim that he was just being cagey. He was truly an atheist, and many people think that way. However, his conception of nature was also so different from the normal conception of nature. I always actually a little bit bristle when he's called a pantheist, because I think that's misleading. He's not a pantheist as it's usually understood. His conception of nature is very unique, and it's a little bit like what some physicists nowadays talk about. It's the final theory of everything. It's the theory. It's the view of nature. It's the laws of nature and the law and the view that would explain why those have to be the laws and no other description can do. So it's a notion of a self-explanatory nature, and he thought that that's the way the world had to be. The world has to be causa sui. It has to explain itself. And he thought to see this, to understand that the world is an explanation for itself, causes such awe, such transcendence. It's an object worthy of religious awe and reverence. It morally transforms one, gets one out of oneself. You see yourself from the viewpoint of radical objectivity. You will never re-enter your own little life in the same way again. It even reconciles you to your finitude, to your mortality, to the fact that you're going to end, which he thinks is what motivates so many of what he calls the superstitious religions, that it has some of the same effects that more traditional religions have. So it's a very spiritualized notion of nature, and it performs some of the same functions that traditional religion does. So in that sense, there's some validity to his claiming that he's a religious man. He's filled with awe, and it's an awe that changes his view of himself, of others, society, death. So there is that religious aspect to it. So I'm sorry, I went on very, very long there, but it's complicated. Spinoza is a very unique position in philosophy, and much misunderstood. So I think those who see him as just a out-and-out atheist, or those who see him as a pantheist, or those who see him as religious, he has his own vocabulary. Everything is defined within the system and has to be understood in the context of that system. Is any of that coherent?
Yeah. I mean, I have to say, I'm once again seeing kind of alarming technical signs on yet a different computer, but that's mildly distracting. But this is but let's persist on faith for at least a little while, and then if I see even more alarming signs, I'll stop. But it's related to something else I'm interested in, and I think you are too, which is, I mean, I guess you could view Spinoza as trying to prepare the world for an age when a traditional conception of God would be harder to sustain. And I know he was concerned with trying to preserve a foundation for moral thought and behavior, even in such a world.
Yes.
And and of course he was Jewish, and I think now that one thing you see in Jewish thought that you still don't see much in Christian thought or Muslim thought is the idea that one can be religious really without believing in God. Is that too strong a formulation of it, or?
I think it's not too strong. I think, belief in God is preferred in traditional circles, but it's not something that's spoken about all that much. It often seems almost beside the point. I mean, Judaism, of course, is especially the branch that I was raised in, Orthodox Judaism, it's a very intellectual religion. The men in my family did what's called sitting and learning, which is, learning Talmud, which is basically, it's the law, and it's the laws implied in all sorts of hypothetical situations, many of them not even applicable today, involving a temple that was destroyed in 70 CE. So although it's very, very intellectual, it's not particularly philosophical. So, proofs for God's existence are not, that's not what one does. Conceptions of God is not particularly important. It's all about the law. And there are certainly people I know who are fulfill the letter of the law. And if you ask them whether they believed in God, either they would look at you as if you were very naive, or if you really press them, would say, no, probably have the same beliefs you do. So it's I know it seems very, very odd, but it's a possibility within Judaism to live the life and feel a deep kinship with the history, with the community, have various psychological needs deeply satisfied by living within that community, and not thinking all that much about whether one believes in God or not.
Mm-hmm. And is this theme very much a part of your latest book?
Well, yes, actually.
I mean, certainly the main character is someone who is, identified as an atheist, but he wrestles with cosmic questions, right?
Oh, well, yeah, but there's no incompatibility, is there? I mean, there is, one can be an atheist, and I think all of us wrestle with cosmic questions just in virtue of being human, atheists, agnostics, and theists alike. He is, the reason he's, I dubbed him the atheist with the soul, or actually in the book it's Time magazine that dubs him the atheist with the soul. Not only is he very interested, as William James was, and he identifies very strongly with William James, in religious emotions and religious experiences and what they're like. But he himself, although he's an atheist, is prone towards a kind of transcendence, feelings of, just expansion out into the world. Again, I think this is completely compatible with atheism, and in some sense, Spinoza gives you that same feeling. Spinoza is all about that kind of expansion and transcendence and a kind of ecstasy, without identifying it as something outside of the universe that you're identifying with. In Spinoza, you're identifying with the universe itself, and that's enough. And Cass has that kind of very transcendent urge, and that is something I think that is completely compatible with atheism. I have that to a large extent. I think probably all artists do. That kind of ecstatic being outside oneself. That's what it's like to create any kind of art. So I think this is all very familiar territory. And,
I guess, but there is the question of does it signify something about the nature of the world? The fact that kind of experience is available to people? You know what I mean?
Yeah. It's an interesting thing about our species, that we have evolved to be able to have this kind of, ecstasy, really stepping outside of oneself, that we have this capacity for extreme objectivity and simply, and the kind of seeing the world, what Tom Snagle, the philosopher, called the view from nowhere, that we can form this conception of what the world is like in and of itself. I think it's an amazing thing that we, the big brains that we evolved. I don't have this capacity. I don't think it's particularly adaptive. It probably gets in the way sometimes, this objectivity. But, it's what, Stephen Jay Gould, I guess, would have called a spandrel. It's an epiphenomenon of having these large brains that we can do mathematics, we can do physics, we can produce great art, and all of these activities presume this being able to step outside of ourselves, and that's an interesting thing that we've evolved. It certainly says something interesting about us.
I guess kind of the reason I ask is, most religious people would say they believe something about the world that atheists don't believe. They may believe there's an actual God, kind of a theistic God, or they may just say more vaguely, I think there's something more, more than the material world. But it sounds to me like you're not suggesting that that experience reflects anything about the world in that sense, right? It's not to have that experience is not to say there's something more.
Exactly. Look, I get that experience when I do mathematics, when I see a beautiful proof in mathematics,
right?
When I listen to Beethoven's Seventh, it's just I am outside myself. I am filled with awe. I think. For me, I am not a believer, and sometimes it seems to me that when one has that experience, there is a tendency to perhaps try to make it more concrete or use it as a metaphor, and that what religion is a kind of metaphor for this experience, and often in religion, it seems to me, we let the metaphor run away with us, and metaphors are always like in some ways and unlike in others, and sometimes it seems to me that partly what happens in religion, the part that I think is false, is yes, it's a metaphor and there are similarities, but then we let the metaphor just carry us away, and we go into the ways in which the religious metaphor is nothing like the experience that we're trying to capture here. For me, the experience is enough. I don't know.
Okay, so transcendent experience doesn't mean there's actual transcendence possible.
No, I mean, no more transcendence in the sense of seeing things outside one's own point of view, getting a sense of where you simply, kind of forget yourself, and that's the source of the word ecstasy. You're standing beside, right? Standing beside yourself. It's a swooningly powerful feeling, and I think it often gives rise to the sense that there's something outside that feeling that's giving it to us. Mm-hmm. It's also a feeling of gratitude. It is a gratitude for whatever it is that is so absorbing your mind and sweeping you away. You're filled with such gratitude. That also, I think, can easily be translated into a conception of God that I think it doesn't support.
Okay. But these experiences by themselves, the kind that you have, you would not say qualify you as religious in even a...
Nope.
In a vague sense, okay.
Nope.
So that's where you draw the line.
Yeah, that is, yeah.
So what, back to the novel, what, I guess it's maybe hard for a novelist to talk about a novel, not wanting to give away the too much, but what do you want to say about the structure of the plot, if anything, in this kind of context, in this kind of cosmic context?
Okay. So, let's see. So here's, I should say, there's a young boy in this story, and he's a boy from a very fundamentalist religious community, a Jewish community, and he's a mathematical prodigy. And this, for me, the whole story began with him. I had first thought of this book or the story that later that grew into this multi-level many-plotted, big, sprawling novel, by thinking about this boy. And that grew out of, when I was an adolescent, I had read this fantastic short story by Thomas Huxley called The Young Archimedes. And it was, I love mathematics very much, and I've always loved fiction about mathematics, mathematicians, and mathematics as well. But this was about this young, this Englishman is traveling in the countryside in Italy, and he's living there he's rented a house, and his young boy has a playmate who's an Italian peasant, little boy. And it turns out this kid is the young Archimedes. He's just an untutored, natural, extraordinary mathematical prodigy. And it's a very sad story, and I'm not going to give it away. But it got me thinking. I suppose because of my background, if a story really grabs me, I start playing with it, and sometimes gets translated into a Jewish context. And I was thinking, what kind of... I was interested in a child with these extraordinary gifts who could be born into a community that wouldn't recognize those gifts and wouldn't allow them to flourish, which is a kind of tragedy, which is a terrible tragedy, actually. And that's how I had first begun to think about this story. But it must have been at least 15 years ago, and I thought it was going to be a very, very tragic story because Huxley's story is very, very tragic. And quite frankly, I just didn't want to write it. I didn't want to I feel it sounds crazy, but these characters, when you bring them to life, they become very real to the writer. And I just couldn't bring this child into existence in order to do something horrible to him. And
really?
Yeah.
You would feel guilty.
I would feel, it would break my heart. It would just break my heart. And, I mean, what happens to the little boy, to Azaria, does break my heart in the story, but believe me, it's a compromise. I was considering, I thought I was going to have to kill him.
A worse fate could have befallen him
yes.
had you not been so delicate yourself.
So at least for 12 years, I sort of carried him around. And then I sort of got very involved in this whole atheism debate and got pulled into these arguments. And so I thought, this will give me a way of figuring all of this out, this little boy, in the context of this current debate between, the new atheists and religion. And it will give me a way of showing that as much as I might side intellectually with the atheists, religion is a very, very complicated thing. There's no such thing as the religious mentality. It's just, and there are many more reasons for remaining within a religious community than, an elementary mistake in logic. And that's basically why the two levels of the novel. If you read it, there's a sort of contemporary level, and then there's a going back in time, and that's how that structure evolved.
And this is not your first novel that has a lot of kind of academic politics in it, right? I mean, that is set in the milieu of academia.
Yeah, they're not all set there. I guess this might, let's see.
Right.
Yeah,
no,
but
your first one was.
Yep. And then I had Properties of Light, a novel of love, betrayal, and quantum physics, and that was very much about academic politics and physics, and then this one partly is about that. Yes.
And do you get a little blowback from academics? I mean, maybe we should get a little back into this question of the kind of resemblance. Well, first of all, resemblance between the context of your novel and some current debates, which you've alluded to, the new atheism and so on.
Right.
And some actual people. I mean, as I said, when I came across your character, Cass Seltzer, the first person I thought of was Dan Dennett, right? I mean, Cass is an academic who, although Dennett had prominence before the new atheism debate, Cass gains prominence by virtue of it, but he becomes a kind of a spokesperson for the movement or for a certain slice of the movement, and he writes about the psychology of religion, which Dan has kind of touched on. What do you? And while I'm at it, I've got to say, his literary agent. I mean, I'm not imagining this right when the name John Brockman enters my mind. I mean, even to the point of this literary agent having a website called, what is it, precipice.org, whereas Brockman's is called edge.org.
Yeah, there might be some similarity there.
There might be something to that. How do you
acknowledge.
handle that issue? I mean, you can really annoy people, right?
I suppose you could, yes. Well, John Brockman has, who's not my agent, but he is, has been Steve Pinker's agent, and a good friend. He has been so instrumental in changing changing our culture, actually. I give him a tremendous amount of credit. And I actually meant it as a kind of homage, that here is a person who, and he's a literary agent, but he has made celebrities out of thinkers, and out of real thinkers, people who don't dumb things down, who are really at the cutting edge, and they, I've watched this happen, and there are so many things to deplore about what's happened to our culture and the dumbing down, and this goes in the exact, the opposite direction. It's so cheering to me, and even before I knew any of these people, or I met the man who became my husband, Steve. It made me happy to see these kind of figures become icons of our culture. I just think it's something to be very, very happy about, and so that is actually something that I sort of tried to get into the novel. This is an amazing thing that somebody could, who is Cass Seltzer, who I have to say, I didn't think of as Dan Dennett or
no,
Richard
he's certainly
Dawkins
not Dan. Kind of.
He's a very, and I don't know who he is. He really is a kind of fiction. I mean, to tell you the truth, he's. The person who has the most in common with Cass Seltzer is me. It's very much my
well, that's
point
a
of
tribute
view.
to you. I was about to say he seems a little more humble than Dan Dennett, with all due respect to Dan. So you are. This is like a revelation that you are Cass Seltzer.
I guess I am. Yes.
You are more Cass Seltzer than Lucinda Mandelbaum, and it was sexist of me to assume that you might be more Lucinda, right?
Yeah, I don't really even approve of Lucinda, I have to say. She's one of my least favorite characters in the novel,
yeah,
although I
would
understand
not have personally,
her. Yeah.
I would not have personally chosen to marry her myself, but she didn't
No,
have.
bad idea to get involved with Lucinda, and
Yeah.
Cass is a very bad judge of his mate module is out of whack as another character tells
Common
him.
problem in human affairs.
Yes, exactly. Another theme in the book is, the way that the religious impulse spills over into contexts that are not religious. I mean, Cass believes this to be the case. I believe this to be the case. And one of the ways in which it does, that he doesn't realize until the end, is in romantic context. The way that we have of deifying the love object and feeling that our life is only worth living if they love us back, and it's a kind of very religious impulse that gets transmuted into a.
Well, another thing that's kind of related to religion. One question I've asked sometimes whole roomfuls of students is, how many of you, at a time of great kind of pressure, when you had a big decision to make, like, am I gonna marry this person, or in a less romantic context, am I gonna accept some job? Am I gonna go to this college? how many of you have found yourselves kind of amenable at that point to omens? In other words, a song comes on the radio that seems to have some eerie connection to the big decision you're going to make. And for at least a second you go, wow, this is somebody telling me something. This seals the decision or something like that. Or and almost always more than 90% of the people, not all of whom would call themselves religious, say yes to that question.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. I think it is, Cass calls it the projection fallacy, that we have a tendency to take ourselves extremely seriously. We really have to. That's a good evolutionary explanation.
You would expect that as a product. You would expect products of natural selection to not ignore their own
exactly.
interests.
And as soon as we evolve so that we have self-consciousness, good Lord, we're going to take that self extremely seriously. And to project that out into the universe, the significance that we feel ourselves to have, to somehow feel that we are that significance to the universe, that it would actually send us omens, seems to be very, very natural. And again, I think one of the impetuses for religion, but I think it is, of course, a fallacy. We are not that significant.
Yeah. So as for some of these arguments for the existence of God, I mean, you've got more fanciful ones and less fanciful ones.
Right.
Yes. Is there one that's kind of closest? You clearly don't find any of them compelling.
Yeah.
Is there one that's closest to that honor?
The last. I think it's the last one, which is Spinoza's God. And
I'm sorry. That's which one? I'm reaching for the book now to see what the last one is.
Is it something like the intelligibility of the universe?
Is this the last in the table of contents or the last in the appendix?
The last in the appendix.
Yeah. You know who else? There's a philosopher here at Princeton who I think is making an argument a little bit like that.
Oh, who is that?
I don't know if you know Mark Johnston.
Oh, Mark Johnston. Well, he's also
his argument sounds like this one sounds.
Yeah. Well, Mark Johnston is certainly somebody who takes Spinoza very, very seriously. I guess one could say a Spinozist. And so this is an argument that I take very seriously. It's the one I think that might be true. And if it's true, it in itself would invalidate, or the mere fact that it could be true, actually, that it could be valid, invalidates, is a way of showing all the other 35 are invalid. So, which is why, of course, Spinoza was seen, although he gets back to your question, was he a theist or an atheist? He saw himself as, in some sense, a theist, but he was also seen as a pernicious atheist, and that's because if his view is possible, all other arguments for more traditional sorts of gods are invalid. So it's a double-edged sword, that argument. But I do take it very seriously. It is, that the universe, that the explanation goes all the way down. That the story with the turtles, that it's turtles all the way down. Well, that it's explanation all the way down. That there are no brute facts. That the universe exists because it had to exist. Anything that realizes this description had to exist. This is a possibility that is very appealing to me. I'm a rationalist. I'm very, very sympathetic to 17th century rationalism. I like the idea that there are reasons for everything, and so ultimately, if we knew what the universe really was, we would understand why it had to exist.
Right.
Yeah.
Of course, religious people sometimes say there's a reason for everything, but they mean something quite different.
They mean something outside of the universe that, transcends the universe. I mean, the way Spinoza always put it was that God is immanent in the universe, not transcendent.
Mm-hmm. Now, the argument from A Wonderful Life in your appendix, is that the idea that people look at their circumstances and go, their own personal circumstances, and say, oh, this is too good to be anything but a gift from someone, or they say that in general, Well, these are, okay, I'm looking at it now. Sometimes people who are lost in life find their way.
Yeah, remember that movie?
It's a Wonderful Life?
Yeah, that's kind of what I had in mind there.
Yeah.
And you're, and this is a very powerful experience when you're completely lost. You feel helpless. There's, and somehow you're saved. Something steps in and seems to save you, or you get on the right track. And it's a very powerful experience to go through.
Yeah. I mean, in thinking about this, one thing that occurred to me is that some of these arguments could equally well be an argument that life is just a dream. Mm. I mean, when I ask myself that question, one seems to be, kind of one piece of evidence that has inclined me toward the idea that life might be just a dream has been kind of related to this, which is not so much that I was lost and then found or anything, but just that my circumstances are pretty good compared to the circumstances of the average person in the world, Mm-hmm. It seems like, what are the chances if I was just born, just thrown randomly into a body on this planet at any time in the whole history of the universe, that I would be in circumstances this good, this lucky, life would be this interesting. So I thought, well, maybe it is just a dream,
Yeah.
But
may it continue to seem just a dream.
I mean, I don't ultimately find that persuasive.
Yeah.
But I guess one thing I'm getting at is that it may be the case that almost everything that could be an argument for the existence of God could also be an argument that life's just a dream.
That's interesting.
Which would be...
But some of us are, of course, having very bad dreams. Not you or me, but...
Well, I have some pretty bad ones.
Yeah.
But no, that's my point. I mean, in the dream scenario, I guess you're the only one.
Yes, you're the only one.
In most dream scenarios, you're the only one who's real, right?
Yeah, I suppose that's right. And because one is a bit of a sadist, one's dreaming up all these other people having not such good lives.
Maybe that would be sadism. I mean, that's a very dangerous thing to believe, of course, because it amounts to a kind of nihilism in terms of how you treat the rest of the world.
Exactly.
And in fact, there was one, somebody who was convicted of murder, some kids or something, supposedly had been influenced by the movie The Matrix. I think they'd convinced themselves that the people they were killing weren't real or something.
Wow, yeah. So I think, fortunately, we've also evolved with a good reality instinct. And, because we wouldn't get very far without it. That is, believing that, what our senses are telling us is real. And I think the inference to the best explanation, even though you and I are leading very wonderful lives compared to what we see around us, the inference to the best explanation is this is real. I mean, what you'd have to make up for this to all just be an elaborate dream is so far-fetched that it's extremely
but that's just by the standards of the dreams that we're familiar with within the dream. I mean, who knows what being it is that's actually having the dream. This is actually, not that I think it is one, but this is related to one other thing about, one other argument that I think is very parallel to arguments for the existence of God, and it's interesting to me that this is an argument that's taken seriously in philosophy, whereas, to most philosophers, if you walk up and say, I have evidence that God exists, they'll say you're nuts. Mm-hmm. Whereas the following argument is getting a very serious hearing, and I'm sure you've come across this, which is the evidence that life is actually a simulation, or the argument that life is likely a simulation. Mm-hmm. Have you come across this?
Yeah.
The idea is something that, once any civilization got to a point where you could do simulations, I think this is the argument, of much complexity, then they would start spawning these simulations at such a rapid rate that from then on, most beings who found themselves in a world would be those who found themselves in a simulated world. Because there would be many more simulated worlds than real worlds.
Yeah.
And I may have totally mischaracterized this argument. My point is just that it is taken seriously by philosophers. It's got a lot of press about a year or two ago. And to me, it's not that different from the question of whether there's a God. I mean, in other words, you could say that whatever computer programmers are doing the simulating, that's God, right? Kind of.
I suppose you could. Yes.
I think I'm.
Yeah.
I think I've lost
have
your
to say.
support here.
What was that?
I think I've lost your support here.
Oh. What does that mean? Does that mean
I don't think you're going to buy into this, but
you've lost. I didn't know whether you meant technical support or
no. I could
philosophical
use some technical support
yeah,
today.
I just have to say this just this just strikes me as so this is a story we could make up. It's such an elaborate story. There's no reason to believe it, really, except that it's a possible story and it's kind of fun to think about. I just find it doesn't even have the emotional comfort of the religious story.
No, that doesn't. It's a pretty sterile scenario.
It's a cold, horrible story, actually, and it's. But I think you're kind of right. I think there are similarities there. And yeah, it's possible. Is that any reason to think it's true? I don't. Yeah, I have to say I've heard these. I've never paid very much attention to them. They just seem to me like.
Yeah, I'm not honestly putting my money on any of them. I have to say.
Yeah. I think. Well, in some sense, the most common sense and natural story about the nature of this world is probably right. I think there is, the world exists outside of us. What we seem to be seeing is often what we're seeing, or that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
These elaborate, fanciful tales don't seem to me to tell us much, except epistemologically. This is given our input, given all the experience we have, this is possible. And that's kind of an interesting epistemological point about knowledge and and how we justify our beliefs, given that these other tales are possible. But ontologically, to me, there's even less claim than religion.
Yeah, well, I fear you may be right. But maybe you would say fear is the wrong word. I mean, you don't believe that that a religious worldview is a prerequisite for having hope or feeling fulfillment or anything else.
Not at all. Not at all. Yeah, and I always kind of wonder about that. Sometimes people will say to me, what gets you up at in the morning if you don't believe in God? And it's just, well, the same things I'm sure they get the person who's asking me up, all the questions I'm trying to understand, the progress I'm trying to make in my understanding, the people I love, everything, is all the wonderful experiences that this life affords us, and also the activities we do to try to make it better for other people.
Mm-hmm. So there's nothing about like the structure of the universe or anything that you kind of wish were different, that you would find more spiritually fulfilling. I mean, beginning with, say, the possibility of an actual personal God out there, or the idea of an afterlife, or the idea, say, that, or something beyond materialism. There's nothing you wish were different.
I would have to say that is true in terms of, just this content and substance of my own life. I think that, maybe this is going to sound very naive. It's just, of course, the old, problem of evil. But given what seems to be the over the top amount of suffering in the world, it actually, I think the thought that there really is a God is horrifying to me.
Yeah.
This just doesn't look like the kind of world.
Yeah.
It's consistent with that. And so I would have to even say on an emotional level, I actually cringe from that. I hope there's not a God, in fact.
Yeah.
Because
I was going to say, when you said the scenario that this is a simulation and there's some computer hacker who programmed it, when you said that was kind of chilling and not satisfying, I thought, Well, yeah, but in the same way, the idea of a God, it's chilling in exactly the way that the idea of a God is, precisely for the reasons you outlined.
Yeah.
It's obviously, if it's an omnipotent God, it is not a God that wishes us well in the sense that we mean well.
Exactly.
You know?
Exactly. Right. So, yeah, so it's, I have to say, on an emotional level, it really, it chills me.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's nothing. To me, the world as it is seems like more than enough for us to be satisfied. Mm-hmm. Just trying to figure it out. It's very puzzling.
Okay,
in this world.
And so, speaking of which, are you pretty satisfied with the novel?
I'm satisfied with the novel. It had seemed to me such a tough thing to do. And as I say, there's this little boy who I thought about a long time ago, and then the other layers. So I'm happy that I was able to do pretty much what I had in mind. The book isn't out yet, and then of course, you know what it's like, sort of once the reviewers get at it and tell you all the things that you ought to have done differently, then you wish you could go back and have done it differently. And
Oh, do you take the reviewers that seriously?
I am terrible that way. I
do not recommend that.
I know it's terrible. It really is, and I seem to get worse and worse with each book. I do take reviews terribly seriously. This time, I swear I'm not going to read them.
Don't you find it possible to convince yourself that every negative reviewer was just completely uncomprehending and therefore isn't to be taken seriously? That works for me.
Can you do that? Oh, well, maybe you can teach me how to do that. No, I was brought up to take criticism very, very seriously.
I take good criticism seriously,
but I take all criticism seriously.
Often, and maybe this is a difference between although you've written both kinds of books, you haven't written only fiction, but maybe it's a difference between a book that kind of makes an argument explicitly.
Yes. No, I think you're right.
Where often you can say, look, they really didn't get what I was trying to say. Maybe it's my fault, but they're critiquing an argument I didn't make.
Yes.
And fiction, which is a very different world.
Yeah, that is very, very true. And it really is what you're saying is absolutely right. When I published, then the last two books were nonfiction. And I was able to pretty much shrug off anything negative, feeling that people do not get what I was saying. But there's an argument, you're right, and they often don't get it. And yes, you do fault yourself for not having made the argument better, but sometimes the arguments are subtle and people are just not getting them. And you're right, fiction is a whole different ball game, and it's and it's all it's also it's a very emotional thing for me to write them. I really bond with these characters. I live their lives. And
that's interesting that you hesitated to wreak too much misfortune on the child.
Yeah.
I've never written fiction. I didn't imagine it being that way. It's funny. It's almost easier for me to imagine a movie director feeling that way, because then it is so vivid, the suffering you inflict,
Yeah.
But I guess if you're going to be a novelist, you have to see these characters as vividly as you would see them in a movie, right?
Oh, so much, so vividly, and they completely saturate your mind. I hear them talking. That's how I'm able to render their speech, because, I can hear their speech. And they all sound different. And that's something that always, for me, in reading novels where everybody sounds the same, I have to put the novel down. That's really, to me, a sign of great weakness for a fiction writer. But I really hear each character very distinctly and individually, know how they feel, and know their their worldview, because that's what a character is. A character is a worldview. It's a subjectivity. And I often, when I'm writing a novel, forget to tell the reader what the character looks like, because that's the thing I'm least interested in.
I think I would have that tendency as well.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah. So, but you really, you are their worldview, so they are you, and it's all it's very personal.
That's intense.
Yes.
And I'm going to stick with nonfiction. That's scary.
That's really wise. That's really wise.
Yeah.
My next book that I've signed for is nonfiction, and so the next few years I don't have to get into this crazy process. It's really quite a crazy process. Giving yourself over to subjectivities which are not quite yours. They are and they're not.
Uh-huh.
And that's what art is.
Yeah. Now that is different. And in closing, do you want to say anything about this next project? Did you say you are going to write a nonfiction book next?
Yeah, I am. I had when I signed with my publisher for this book, I signed for 2 books, and the next book is sort of about Plato.
Ah.
It's Plato and the discovery of this distinct type of question, the philosophical question that emerges in so many different areas in science and in math and in language and ethics and just every area of human cognition, that there's a kind of philosophical question in politics that emerges, and why they're still with us even after all the advances of science, that there's something about these questions that elude complete explanation by science.
That sounds good. And your editor is going to be Dan Frank for that
It
as well?
is, yes.
Yeah, he's a great editor.
Oh, he is. It's the first time I've worked with him. This is my 9th book, and the first time I've worked with him, but I've always wanted to work with him, and I'm just very, very happy.
Well, tell him I said hello.
I will.
And in closing, let me hold your book up to the camera again and recommend that everyone read it. It's so well suited for for the Blogging Heads constituency, because they're very interested in ideas and the people who promulgate ideas, and in cosmic questions. So, you're at the right place.
Great.
And
well, thank you. Thank you so much for speaking with me about it. It's been so much fun.
My pleasure, and good luck with it, and I hope you'll come back after this next project is done and talk about Plato.
Oh, I'd love to.
Okay. Well, take care, Rebecca.
You too, Bob. Bye-bye.